My name is Peter Martens, and I'm a lecturer in cello at Stellenbosch University, and I'm the principal cellist of the Cape Town Philharmonic Orchestra. I'm going to speak to you about my PhD research, and the title of my dissertation is Contemporary Performance of the Sonatas for Cello and Piano by Ludwig van Beethoven as informed by Carl Czerny. This particular study has a lot to do with tempo, and the effect that tempo has on the mood and character of these works, and in particular Beethoven's personal views on tempo. This study is contextualized within the concept of performance and historically informed performance practice, we sometimes call that HIP, as well as the performance history of the works themselves. I'm not going to speak a lot about HIP. Suffice to say that the idea of authenticity, in other words reproducing the way that they played in those days, has long since been abandoned as an ideal for HIP. Rather, these days, we are inspired by what happened in those days, but realize that we cannot strive for authenticity in the truest sense, because we can't replicate the ears and the context of the listeners of those days. Then when it comes to performance history, the performance history of Beethoven's cello sonatas obviously starts with the cellists that Beethoven himself played with. I had a look at these cellists and the way that they played, and tried to look at anecdotes regarding specific performances of Beethoven's cello sonatas. I then looked at the students of these cellists, and then the next generation and the next generation and so forth, and discovered that through history there was pretty much a steady line whereby the sonatas initially received a very classical and clean interpretation, and throughout history it became more and more, the tempi became more and more varied, and the inclusion of romantic gestures, shall we say, such as glissandi and the like, became more and more prevalent. We got to a point at around 1960, shall we say, where this pretty solid development in the performance history of the works then split into three different streams. And so today we have three different streams when it comes to the way that these sonatas are performed. One stream is probably a continuation of the stream from Beethoven's time itself, and this would be called perhaps old school romantic interpretation. So this romanticizing of the way that we play is being perpetuated by the likes of wonderful cellists like Michel Maisky, for example. Then we have this hip performances on period instruments, and David Watkins is probably a good example of a person who performs the Beethoven sonatas in this manner. And then in between we have cellists who play on modern instruments, but are also very much inspired by the hip movement, and I think Heinrich Schiff is probably a fantastic example of a cellist who has taken a lot of inspiration from historically informed performance practice and applied that to a performance on a modern instrument. The third stream of discourse within which I've anchored my study has been the notion of performance itself. The notion that performance is the work. Once a composer has written a piece of music, in other words, he's put his marks on the piece of paper, the work has merely been born. The work only then starts to live through its countless performances. And this brings about the question of the value of the player. If we believe that we are contributing to the life of a piece of music, then for that brief period in which we play that work, we are sitting alongside the composer as a co-creator. And this is why performance is unique. This is why performance will never die, because it's a unique creation every time. And this is why we can have any number of performances and the art will never become old. The idea of performance being the work, or the work being performance if you like, led me to investigate the concept of PBR, performance-based research, or performance-led research, or practice-based research if you like. This is a contentious issue between academics and performers at the moment. So when is performance research? When can performance be considered research? Well, there are three criteria that need to be met. The investigation should be intended as research. So you can't, after a concert, just tell somebody you've been engaging in research. That's not research. Research involves original contributions. So the work should not previously have been carried out by other people. And then thirdly, the aim must be to enhance knowledge and understanding. So before I got into the nitty-gritty of the works themselves, I investigated the concept of tempo. There are very few writings on tempo as a construct, as an element of musical structure itself. Tempo is an element of musical time, like rhythm, for example. And there are some German philosophers who have written about tempo from this point of view, and it's very interesting. And of all the elements of musical, not even only of musical time, but of all the elements of music as a whole, Beethoven placed tempo at the top of the list. For him, tempo was not a straitjacket that restricted your performance in any way, but it was basically the key to unlocking the freedom that you need to perform a particular piece of music. In other words, the key to unlocking the emotion, the musicality, if you want to use that word, of a piece, lied for Beethoven in selecting the correct tempo. I had to do several things before I could speak about tempo and metronome marks in the Beethoven cello sonatas, because Beethoven himself didn't leave any metronome marks for these sonatas. He wanted to. He was busy working on a collected edition of all his works just before he died, and the metronome marks were going to be in there, but he died prematurely, and so for many works he did not leave metronome marks. But we're very lucky to have metronome marks from his close friend and pupil, Carl Czerny. The skeptics question whether Czerny is a reliable source on Beethoven tempi, so I had to investigate that as well. Beethoven taught Czerny as a boy, and correspondence between Czerny and Beethoven shows a continual mutual respect. Beethoven asked Czerny to give the Viennese premiere of the Emperor Concerto, and there is actually a story about the Opus 16 work, which is for winds and piano, that is often used to discredit Czerny as a reliable source on Beethoven tempi. But if one knows that story, and I don't have the time to get into it now, it's actually a wonderful story corroborating Beethoven's faith in Czerny as an honest interpreter of his music. Czerny also taught Beethoven's nephew Carl, and perhaps most importantly, Czerny learned all of Beethoven's piano music from memory. Every note that he'd written for the piano, Czerny had in memory. And it seems to me that he didn't have a photographic memory, that he really learnt this music. Beethoven's personal views on tempo are also sometimes contested, but in musicological circles these days it's pretty much accepted that Beethoven was very, very particular about his view on tempo being the most important element of the music. I've got a list of all sorts of anecdotes, letters that support the idea that Beethoven viewed tempo as the most important element of musical interpretation. Just a little bit about Czerny's book, from which we glean many of these metronome marks as well as instructions on how to perform the sonatas for cello and piano. The book, the English title of the book, is On the Proper Performance of All Beethoven's Works for the Piano. Czerny didn't actually write a book with that title. Czerny is the author of its content. It's taken from various other works that Czerny did write. It's taken from his reminiscences of Beethoven, and from chapters 2 and 3 from the proper performance of all Beethoven's works for piano solo, and 3 on the proper performance of all Beethoven's works for the pianoforte with accompaniments for other instruments. It's quite a long story, but basically Czerny's Opus 500 is a great big document, and we've extracted the bits that have to do with Beethoven in particular and put them in a book called On the Proper Performance of All Beethoven's Works for the Piano. And here it's important to mention that there's been a little bit of meaning lost in translation, I think, because what it should actually say is all Beethoven's works that have a piano part. So this includes not only solo piano works or concerti, but also all the chamber music and the sonatas that have piano parts. So we have this wonderful book by Carl Czerny that gives us various metronome marks. And if we look at the sonatas themselves, they are absolutely unique in the history of sonatas for cello and piano. Nothing like them had been written by any composer before Beethoven, and it was several years before Mendelssohn and Brahms were to write their sonatas. They stand like a pillar of glory in this world of music for cello and piano together. Both the Opus 5 sonatas, so the first and the second sonata, start with a longish opening adagio. These sections have been misinterpreted as movements in their own right and played over the years at slower and slower and slower tempi. So we've gotten used to tempi that are incredibly slow. According to Czerny, this is not what Beethoven intended. And even according to Beethoven himself, he never wrote a slow movement dedicated to the cello until he got to the final sonata in D major. So these slow sections at the beginning of the Opus 5 number 1 sonata in F major and at the beginning of the Opus 5 number 2 sonata in G minor are really introductions. And if we view them as introductions and don't make such a great big meal out of them, and we take the tempo that Czerny intended us to, or that Czerny reported that Beethoven intended us to use, we see a very different music to the music that we have become accustomed to with these works. So I'm going to use the opening part of the sonata, the second sonata, just to give you an example. And I'm sorry I'm not very good with text, so I don't have the piano part and a pianist and everything, but I think I can still make my point. So the G minor sonata starts with a chord with the piano and the cello. Then and that opening should be familiar to almost all cellists, and more or less at that tempo. But the tempo that Czerny instructs us to play there is crotchet equals 50. Now I haven't got my metronome out because it's going to take too much time, but I can more or less approximate that. In fact, if you look at your watch and you look at the second hand, you can get 60 quite easily, so 50 would be... Now that's a crotchet, not a quaver. That means the sonata should go something like this. Now you see what the faster, I'm going to put faster in inverted commas, now you see what the faster tempo actually does. It eliminates this feeling of quaver beats in the bar, and it makes everything flow much more rapidly, so that we have and it gives that music a completely different feeling. And this is where we've missed the point, I think, with so many of Beethoven's slow movements, is we've misinterpreted the musical pulse. We've often attributed a smaller note value to the musical pulse. So in this case we've often attributed a quaver as the musical pulse rather than a crotchet. And by understanding these tempi, or by trying out these tempi in practice that Czerny have given us, we find a whole new shape and form to the music. You can just imagine this theme on a piano that Beethoven himself might have had. This at anything slower than that, the notes would not have resonated long enough. Of course, a cellist has a long bow and can sustain notes, but a piano not. And these melodies on the instruments for which they were written would have had to go somewhat more flowing for them to make any sense whatsoever in the time of Beethoven. Now, I know we don't have a lot of time, but just quickly, the beginning. Beethoven moved to Vienna. If I have my dates correctly, I think it's at the end of 1792. He got there 2 weeks after Mozart died, and he was in time to attend a performance of the Mozart Requiem arranged by Baron von Swieten as a fundraiser for Mozart's widow, Constanza. And I don't have definitive proof that Beethoven was actually at that concert, but it seems highly, highly likely that he was. Now just imagine the Rex Tremenda from Mozart's Requiem. Jim, Rex. Imagine the impression that unbelievably stirring music would have had on the young Beethoven. And a few years later, in the same key, with the same dotted rhythm, even the same shape descending dotted rhythm scale going down, he's paying homage to Mozart's Requiem. I can't prove that, but it's a good story if it happens to be proven. I think it's highly likely that it happened. After the Opus 5 sonatas, he wrote a sonata, Opus 17, for French horn and piano. For the French horn virtuoso Giovanni Punto. Actually, Giovanni Punto changed his name to sound fancy, like an Italian name, but he was born Jan Vaclav Stich, and then he became German, Johann Wenzel Stich, and then eventually he decided he'd like an Italian flavour to his name. But the horn sonata, of course, really sounds like something for the French horn in the beginning. But Beethoven had it published for French horn or cello. Beethoven himself played it with a cellist and was very, very satisfied with it in its cello guise. And as a result, Czerny categorizes this sonata as one of 6 sonatas for cello and piano by Beethoven. So I have also included the Opus 17 sonata, and I would strongly recommend this as a wonderful 15-minute piece should any cellist be programming a recital and have not thought of this particular sonata. I want to spend a little bit of time on the next sonata. Of course, there's only time to give you little tidbits from various sonatas. But the Opus 69 sonata is a particularly beautiful sonata. Beethoven knew it was a beautiful sonata. He said so to his friends. Just to remind you of the opening theme. So it's that one. There's a wonderful moment in the sonata where the piano and the cello alternate with one another, and they play this. I'll play it for you quickly. And this Beethoven took from St. John Passion by Johann Sebastian Bach, and it's really incredible how he incorporated, you know, in the St. John Passion, it's this aria, Es ist vollbracht. It has been done, it is complete. The prophecy has been fulfilled. And it's Mary having seen that Jesus has risen from the dead. And it's an aria for alto and solo viola da gamba. And the relationship between the voice and the viola da gamba has been perfectly replicated by Beethoven in the relationship between the piano part and the cello part. So there's little doubt that Beethoven had the Bach variant in mind when he put it into this A major sonata. And it's really quite touching if in the context of the whole sonata. He wrote it for a friend of his called Ignaz von Gleichenstein, who was an amateur cellist, and he was the war secretary in Vienna at the time. And you know, with the invasions of Napoleon in Vienna, 1809, both Beethoven and his friend would have witnessed ghastly deaths in the city, perhaps even had to walk over bleeding bodies in the street, you know. And there Beethoven produces this absolutely beautiful piece of music. And he wrote with his pencil on the title page, Inter lacrimas et luctum, in Latin of course, twixt tears and pain. And it does seem as if he's saying to his friend, the amateur cellist Ignaz von Gleichenstein, for whom he dedicated the piece, it seems as if he's saying to him, look, I know life is difficult, life is terrible. By the way, there was a common friend of theirs whose wife had just died at the time as well, so it was really a bad time for them. And he was saying, but in all of this mess, here is some music that will uplift your spirits, that is beautiful, and that makes this Bach quote, although it's just contextual, it does make this Bach quote all the more beautiful and meaningful. I'd love to speak more about the first movement and various aspects of this sonata, but the time is running. Oh yes, just a cautionary note for pianists. Two things actually with regard to the scherzo of this particular sonata. The first chord is forte. There are various editions. Some of them have forte piano, some of them have piano then forte, some of them just have piano for a note and then forte a bar later. Jonathan Dalmar edited the newest Bärenreiter edition of this piece and dedicated several pages in the notes to his research on the dynamic of the first note of the scherzo. It's incredible research, taking into account how long the ink would have had to dry before Beethoven smudged it and wrote something else and wrote a letter then to his publisher, blah blah blah. In any case, trust me, the first note of this scherzo is supposed to be forte. So the piano starts and then the cello comes in. And there has been a lot of debate about how the pianist should play that theme, because this note is actually two crotchets tied together over the bar line. So there's a tie and a tie and a tie. And cellists obviously don't make a break between the two notes under the tie. But Czerny says to us that the pianist should do so. So he said this notation symbolizes something wholly peculiar. And he says pianists need to play that tied note. They need to re-articulate the second note of that tied note. And it's a kind of what they called Bärbung in those days. So they repeat the note. Also, not enough time to go into a lengthy explanation about that. Suffice to say that the research is pretty solid. The pianist should articulate the second note in a manner that is particular to the instrument, and the cellist should articulate. Remember, the proper definition of the word articulate means to join. An articulated bus is a bus that's joined together. And the cellist should articulate those two notes in a manner that is particular to the cello. And that is why the pianist actually separates the notes, Beethoven wrote the fingering 4-3, 4-3 in the piano part 114 times, so he must have meant something by it. The pianist has to separate those notes. The cellist has to join those notes. The last movement also starts with a adagio cantabile, and the metronome mark from Czerny is quaver equals 66, which is again a much more flowing and very beautiful way of making the piano's notes connect without there being holes in between. And I would urge any cellist who is not familiar with the Czerny metronome marks to really this particular just to play this in a somewhat more flowing tempo, which completely changes the mood of the music. And then the last movement is very rapid indeed and very, very exciting. Then the next sonata is the Opus 102 number 1 sonata, and this is where I think I got it wrong in my doctoral thesis. I looked at the metronome mark of Czerny and diligently performed the piece at quaver equals 66. But it's not andante. I've since found evidence that Beethoven wanted this not to go at quaver equals 66, but quaver at 88. 88 and 66 were on the same side of the pendulum on his metronome, and branded it to the wood with a hot metal numbers, and the sixes kind of joined together at the top and looked very much like eights. And Beethoven was terrible at arithmetic, and he was also terrible at setting metronome marks. He couldn't do that by himself. He often had his nephew Carl helping him with that, and they would sit in a dark room with a candle, and Beethoven would play on the piano, and Carl would set the thing ticking and say, "Uncle, it's 66. This one, unfortunately, got misread. 88 and 66 got confused with one another. But we have a letter of Beethoven clarifying that. Beethoven wrote to his publisher a bit later, and he did say he wanted this one to go at 88. So we know it should be 88. And the difference just is amazing, just between 66 and 88, how it eliminates that quaver pulse and puts a dotted crotchet pulse so that you can really experience the time signature of 6/8. Isn't that far less ploddy than the first version I played you? I think, seeing as we are pretty much running out of time, I would just like to draw your attention to perhaps one element of the final sonata. The final sonata has an amazing fugue in it, and it also has the only dedicated slow movement written for cello and piano. There are recordings of this piece at less than half or more than twice as slow as what Beethoven intended. And I can only say the metronome mark of quaver equals 60. It's the same, it's a funeral march, and it's the same tempo that he prescribed for the funeral march in the Eroica Symphony. And to play this piece at the metronome mark, adagio con molto sentimento de affetto, gives it a profundity that no other tempo seems to be able to reveal. keep up that throughout the whole movement, rather than feeling each quaver, just makes it incredibly poignant. So I think I've given you just a few bits and pieces from the sonatas, mostly tempo-related things, to give you a small window into my research on tempo, specifically about Beethoven's sonatas for cello and piano. And I'm going to end off by just reading for you one paragraph from the conclusion. No claim has been made that this research has resulted in a definitive interpretation of Beethoven's sonatas for cello and piano. Suffice to say that the application thereof in performance has inspired both listeners and performers alike. The art of music making decrees that each and every performance will be different, and this holds true even for performers who adopt the notion of a correct tempo for Beethoven's works, as implied by the title of Czerny's book. If one embraces the concept of the performance being the work, and if one embraces the new knowledge put forward by these performances, then, at the very least, one must concede that we are embarking on a new chapter in the life of Beethoven's sonatas for cello and piano. Thank you for listening.